But today we welcome all the humanists, atheists, free thinkers, and other critical thinkers and skeptics in this and surrounding communities. I'd like to acknowledge that the land where we work, live, and build community has been a place where people have lived for over 13,000 years. This is a land acknowledgement for those of you who haven't experienced one yet, but it's becoming more and more common. This land is the territory of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and their neighbors in the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. We wish to respect the continued connections with past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Greater Boston area. We would like to invite all to get involved in anti-colonialist and Indigenous land struggles wherever you may live. Most of you are no strangers to humanism and what it stands for, but I'm going to put a couple of items in the chat area so that if you are new to humanism or you have some need of review, you can check it out. Plus, I have some links to other groups in the area and resources. So that will be coming shortly to the chat area. Sometimes it's difficult to get things to work out. Yep, that's in there. I will also post the resources a bit later in case somebody joins late, and then they'll have access to those links. A couple of quick announcements before our talk. The Concord Humanists will be having a talk this coming Tuesday, October 5th, in just 2 days at 7 p.m. with developmental neuroscientist David Rose on the artful brain, Mona Lisa's smile. I will put in links to that, but all of these activities that I'll mention are on our website, bostonhumanists.org, which is the meetup site. The Worcester Humanists will have a talk on Tuesday, October 12 at 7 p.m. on selling humanism with author and humanist activist Gordon Gamm, JD. That will be a hybrid event, so if you happen to live in the Worcester area, you can actually consider going to that event. But it will also be on Zoom. Alternatively, the AHA Center for Education Critical Minds series will have a talk that same Tuesday, October 12 at 7 p.m. with Mark Reimers on science and the future of humanism. This talk will be recorded and on the YouTube AHA channel, so in case you want to go to the Worcester talk, you can actually do both. The Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard and MIT will sponsor a secular mindfulness meditation. This is a monthly thing. This month it will be Tuesday, October 19 at 7 p.m. And finally, it's important for you to take note that next month, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is going to have their 44th annual convention right here in Boston. And that's at the Boston Park Plaza Hotel. They've got Margaret Atwood, Phil Zuckerman, Linda Greenhouse, Steve Pinker, Chris Cameron, David Tamayo, Ann Droyan, and Sasha Sagan, as well as Catherine Stewart and the aforementioned Chris Cameron, who spoke before us here at Greater Boston Humanists last year. And so one last thing is our group here is going to have, once again, a monthly Humanist Happy Social Hour, which will start up again this fall with Monday, October the 25th. Also, I think at 7:30 p.m. You can check the site. And it will be, the topic on the 25th of this month will be, how do you celebrate Halloween as a humanist? Just how do you personally do it? It's a very personalized kind of hangout. It's not a big talk or anything. So now for today's talk, this is by Lee McIntyre, a frequent and valued member of our community here in Boston. And he'll be speaking about the topic of his new book, which is entitled How to Talk to a Science Denier. He's a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University and an instructor in ethics at the Harvard Extension School. His previous publications include The Scientific Attitude, Defending Science from Denial, Fraud, and Pseudoscience, PostTruth, and the book Respecting Truth, Willful Ignorance in the Internet Age. So please welcome our speaker, Lee McIntyre.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I wish this could be in person. Of course, I understand why it can't be, but it's good to see you folks again. I wanted to talk to you today about a very important topic, a very familiar topic to all of us, which is how to defend science from science deniers by giving scientists and friends of science, science communicators, all the allies of science, some better tools to push back against them, which is, of course, very important with COVID denial. Now, you might wonder right at the very beginning, what could be better than scientific evidence? I mean, that's the ultimate way to push back against a science denier. But here's the problem. You don't convince somebody who doesn't hold their beliefs based on good evidence by giving them more evidence. It's not going to convince them. That is called the information deficit model, where you're treating your interlocutor like a scientist, and you just give them the good evidence and they'll come around, but that doesn't work. So we need a bit more strategic approach. And the first thing I'm going to do is to start talking about what the research, what the scientific literature tells us. The first thing to do is to dispel with a worry that you might have. Some folks remember the backfire effect from 2010 when Bridenstine and Jason Riefler wrote their paper, which argued that if you had somebody who was a partisan, who believed something that was incorrect, and you provided them with correcting information, that they wouldn't change their mind. Now, that's not quite the backfire effect. The backfire effect was on top of that, which was the idea that not only wouldn't they change their mind, but they would double down on their false belief, which is to say that in a perverse way, the correcting information confirmed their false belief. Not just that it didn't affect it, but it made their false belief worse, okay? And this was a horrible thing, right? The New Yorker and the Atlantic wrote these articles in other places saying, this is terrible. This means that we can't even really open our mouth in front of somebody who is a science denier, because if we do so, we might be making the problem worse. So maybe we should just all shut up about it. Well, here's some good news. Recent studies have shown that the backfire effect could not be reproduced. The first part of it, the idea that you present them with correcting information and it won't change their mind, that was upheld. But it was that other piece of it, the kind of, certain hyper-partisans would double down on their beliefs. That turned out to be a unicorn. They saw it once and they never saw it again. And even the original researchers came around to agree with Porter and Wood, who had done the definitive study to show that it couldn't be reproduced. And so it's now accepted in the literature that the backfire effect doesn't exist, which is great news because it means that you can get out there and talk to anyone that you want and you're not going to actually make it worse. As one commentator in the debate put it, we're fact resistant, but we're not fact immune. Okay, so what should we do? There was a study in the summer of 2019 in the journal Nature Human Behavior by Cornelia Batch and Philip Schmid, which was groundbreaking. This study provided the first empirical evidence to show that you could mitigate the effects of false belief. It didn't always work. It wasn't going to work in every single case, but it showed with statistical significance that you could push back against science deniers and get them to change their views, which is, again, amazing news. Let me just say a word about the study. I joke with my friends that I'd been studying this so long, looking for empirical evidence. And so when I read this study, I said I could have read it if my hair were on fire, right? Now, maybe that's a little confirmation bias on my part, right? A little motivated reasoning. I wanted the study to be true, but here it was. So I was happy about it. And I think we all should be. What they did is they had 1,700 subjects, some in the USA, some in Germany. Study was done online. And the study was about debunking. So what they would do, kind of like the Nine and Riefler study, they would present false information, and then they would immediately debunk it. And again, what they found is that it worked in a statistically significant number of cases. There were two ways that they did the debunking. One was what they called content rebuttal. That's if, say, you're a climatologist and the subject is, climate change, and you present somebody with false information, that suggests that global warming isn't real, and then you debunk it with true content, because you're an expert in that subject, and that's one thing that worked. But of course, then the question comes up, okay, so do you have to be a scientist to debunk somebody? And the answer is no, because there was a second thing called technique rebuttal. And technique rebuttal is something that you can engage in even if you're not a scientist. And it's based on the idea that all science denial reasoning is the same, whether the subject is COVID or flat Earth or evolution or anything you want. It all follows the exact same flawed blueprint. And I'm going to give that to you now. This was based on some earlier work done by the Hufnagel brothers and also John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski and others. So all science denial follows this script. They cherry pick evidence. They believe in conspiracy theories. They rely on fake experts and discredit real experts. They engage in illogical reasoning. And my favorite, they insist that science has to be perfect, which is to say, if science can't prove its result, then they say, aha, my result, my theory might be true. Worse than that, my theory is just as likely to be true as yours because you can't prove yours to me. And what Beichenschmidt showed is that if you learn these 5 tropes and you learn how to push back against them, really not talking about the evidence that they'll give you, but how they're reasoning about the evidence, how they're thinking, their process of reasoning, that will work also. And this was fascinating to me. It worked just as well as content rebuttal. And there was no additive effect between them, which means that even if you're not a scientist, you have just as big of a role in pushing back against science denial as a scientist does. So, I mean, this is really terrifically good news. Okay. Now, there was some bad news in the study, which was that they showed that you could only mitigate but not overturn all belief. That once disinformation had gotten out there into the community, it was going to do damage. There were going to be some people who were just going to believe it. And you could get to some of them, but you couldn't get to all of them. And so that's a worry. This is not a flaw in the study, by the way. It's just something else that they found. So there's still going to be a negative effect from disinformation, which we sort of kind of would suspect, I think, given what's been going on recently. And their conclusion was that the best possible thing you could do to fight back against science denial was to keep science deniers from hearing disinformation in the first place. And they joked that if you were invited to a debate, cancel at the last minute if it means that the debate's going to be canceled, because then you're not giving your opponent a microphone to get the word out there. If the debate's going to go on, you got to show up, you got to debunk it. Maybe you've all seen that famous one between Bill Nye and Kenneth Ham, right? But the problem is when the person with the disinformation has a microphone, there's just a certain percentage of the audience that's going to be taken in, no matter how much you debunk what they say. All right. So other limitations in the study, these were ones that I identified and kind of thought, well, because I'm a philosopher and a methodologist and I'm always wanting to push, how far could you take this result? So this was a brilliant result, but I wanted to take it further than they had taken it. And I noticed 2 things. First, they were really only dealing with people that I would consider to be the audience for science denial. That is, they were dealing with people who had just heard disinformation. So they were kind of naive, the virgin audience. They had just heard the disinformation and then it was immediately debunked. By the way, you can also do something called pre-bunking, right? Which my colleague Andy Norman is working on in his book, Mental Immunity, right? How to get to people before they hear the disinformation. That's important too. But my question was this: what do you do about the people who have been marinating in scientific disinformation for a decade? Because face it, that's a significant number of people. That's, your uncle across the table at Thanksgiving. That's the people that you're going to, see on network TV, or the Disinformation Dozen, out there on Twitter, who are just sharing this stuff. They're people who are really in so deep that, you're not going to be able to just debunk them easily. The second drawback I saw in the study was that it was only done online. Now, I understand why studies are done online. It's important. They couldn't have had 1,700 people from US and Germany in quite the way that they did in real time. But the other thing that I wanted to know was, not only are a significant number of science deniers hardcore, but they're also, where do you meet them? You meet them in person, right? You don't meet them online. Sometimes you meet them online, but sometimes you meet them in person and you have to know what you're going to say. And so I wondered, would technique rebuttal work in person? Would it maybe even work better in person? Because face it, the worst possible way to convince somebody is online. I mean, if you've ever had a back and forth on Twitter, or in the comments section of a Washington Post article, you're not going to convince anybody. But if you talk to somebody face to face, you might have a better shot. Now, I think so the Betch and Schmid study I loved, but I had these two questions, and I think there are answers to them. Unfortunately, they're not answers that exist to date, to my awareness, in the scientific literature. But there is a very extensive anecdotal literature on science deniers that anybody can find. And I sort of read this obsessively to see, amongst hardcore deniers, how do they change their mind? What is the circumstance? So if you Google, I was an anti-vaxxer and I changed my mind, what story are you going to hear? And when I did this, what I discovered is that it's always the same story. It's not just that there are hardcore deniers who change their mind. It's that when they change their mind, it always happens in the same way. Virtually everybody who's had their mind changed about evolution or COVID or climate change, it happens after a face-to-face encounter where they meet someone that they trust. Either they already trusted them or they grow to trust them. That's when evidence can begin to count, right? Because if you think about it, science denial is not just based on doubt. Doubt can be overcome by evidence. It's based on distrust. And if you distrust the person providing the evidence, then nothing they say is really going to convince you. So the goal of these conversations sometimes is not just to share the facts, it's to get the other person to trust you. Because once the other person trusts you, then the facts can begin to make a difference. Now, again, these examples are out there in the media, and you can all find them. I've got a thick file on my desk of these, and I read them as they come in. People send them to me now, knowing that this is what I'm interested in. And what it shows is that engagement is the key to overcoming science denial. Two of my favorite stories are these. There was a measles outbreak in Clark County, Washington, in Vancouver, Washington state, in about 2014, 2015, whenever that horrid measles outbreak was. They've got quite an extensive anti-vaxxer community there, and also in Portland, Oregon, just across the river where I grew up. And Governor Jay Inslee in Washington, who's no science denier, he ran for president on a climate change platform. He sent public health officials down to Clark County to talk to the anti-vaxxers to see if he could get them to vaccinate their kids with the MMR vaccine, and it worked. It didn't work for everybody, but what he did was, by sending these public health people down there to engage with the community, sometimes one-on-one, in a personal way, it had an effect. There's an article on this that you can read. The title of the article is something weird. It's called "It Will Take Off Like Wildfire." It's in the Washington Post. And where this one anti-vaxxer said that there was this scientist who came down with a whiteboard and explained cell interaction for 2 hours. And he was so warm and he was so trustworthy that by the end of it, she changed her mind. and she, decided to vaccinate. And this wasn't the only case. So I'm not just cherry picking off the one case where this happened. This, if you read more about what happened there, it was quite a successful intervention, is how you want to think of it. My favorite story of a hardcore denier giving up his view was Jim Bridenstine, who some of you may remember was a member of Congress, who gave a speech on the House floor saying all the things that climate deniers say. And of course, what happened next, Trump appointed him as head of NASA, because what else would you do with a hardcore science denier but appoint him to be head of NASA, where some of the greatest work is done on climate change. Well, interesting thing happened. Within a month or two, Bridenstine changed his mind. And he didn't just change his mind, he did a full mea culpa. He went out in public and gave a speech in which he said, I was wrong, climate change is real, and humans are causing it. Now, what could possibly account for this? They interviewed him and he said, well, he read a lot. Well, presumably he'd read some things before as well. Here's what I think happened. He was working at NASA. This was pre-COVID. He was there interacting with the scientists, got to know them as people. They weren't the faceless other, the people that he distrusted because they were the other. They were the folks that he had lunch with, the folks that he hung out in the hallway, the people that he was their supervisor. And he had that same epiphany that the woman in Vancouver had. These are warm and trustworthy people. I kind of like them. Maybe they're right about climate change. And he changed his mind. The point of these two stories is that even empirical beliefs can be tribal. And if we're surrounding ourselves with people who give us misinformation, that's who we're going to believe. So the way to reach science deniers is to enlarge their community, start to flood their community with people who believe in science, and they'll realize they're not such bad people, okay? We've all had that experience as humanists, right? That people have stereotypes about what we're like before they met us, but then they meet us and they figure out, they're really pretty nice people, not the immoralists that they might think that we are. All right. So my conclusion from all this is that belief is often shaped by issues of trust and identity and values. Science denial is not a question of facts. It's often a question of identity. The folks who are science deniers are believing what they believe, not just because they think good evidence, but because it's who they are. It's their community. It's how they define themselves. Now, again, that presents a bit of a problem, because then how do you get the evidence to them, right? Jonathan Swift said, you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place, okay? So that's a real difficulty. But once you've engaged with them, once you've spoken to them, once you're part of their community, you can begin to get through to them. All right, so as it turns out, when you're dealing with hardcore deniers, how you deal with them matters a lot. Your attitude, the context in which you're speaking with them matters a lot. Face-to-face is best. You have to remain calm. You can't insult them. You can't yell. You have to be patient and show respect. You have to listen to them. And the interesting thing is that if you listen to them, often they will share with you what you need to know in order to talk to them. Notice the title of my book is not How to Convince a Science Denier, it's How to Talk to a Science Denier, because you have to talk to them first and get them to listen in order to have the goal of trying to convince them. All right, and so here I want to talk to you about one of my personal experience going out to do this. So in November 2018, I flew out to Denver and I went to the Flat Earth International Conference. And the fact that this existed blew me away. And I thought, I've got to go. I've got to get out there and give this a try. And for the first day, I kept my mouth shut and I just listened to what they had to say. I kind of was incognito. I didn't want to lie to them, but I wanted to hear what they believed. Now, I caught a break here because to a person, the flat earthers said that their views were not based on faith, but on evidence. 70% of them were evangelical Christians, okay? And so my question was, okay, so is this a faith-based belief? In which case I've really got very little chance of trying to convince them to give it up. But even though a number of them, 70% of them, were part of the faith-based community, they maintained that their beliefs were based on evidence, which gave me an opening. Because what I could do then is talk to them not just about the evidence, but I wanted to be even more subtle than that. I wanted to do technique rebuttal. Now, this was before the technique rebuttal paper came out, but I was already doing it. I'm a philosopher. I'm not a physicist. And I hope I know enough physics to, try to poke some holes in their views that the Earth is flat. But you know what? They'd read all that literature and rejected it. Either NASA was lying or, for whatever reason. They didn't believe it. So I thought, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to talk to them about how they're reasoning based on the evidence, about their logic, about, the techniques of reasoning that they're using here. My key question was one from Karl Popper. This idea that, so the conversation would often go like this. I'd say, okay, so you're part of the faith-based community, but your belief here is based on evidence, right? Yes, absolutely. Okay. So tell me this then. What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, could convince you that you were wrong? And they could not answer that question. And the intelligent ones amongst them were very uncomfortable that they couldn't answer that question, because that's the question, right? If you think about Karl Popper's work, every scientist should be able to answer that question. Every scientist should be able to, I wrote a book about this, The Scientific Attitude, that I think the most distinctive thing about science is that scientists believe in, they care about evidence, and they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence. So every scientist could say to you, if you could show me X, Y, Z, I would change my views. The flat earthers were not able to do that. So I think of deniers as not just people who go against the scientific consensus, because, sometimes Galileo does that. It's people who go against the scientific consensus, but they cannot tell you either they don't have good evidence for their beliefs, and they cannot tell you what evidence you might present to convince them to give up their beliefs, which means that their beliefs are not based on evidence. As I said, they're based on identity. Now, that's a pretty tough draw. How do you talk to somebody out of their identity? It's like talking them out of their religion. It's like talking them out of their political beliefs. It's very difficult to, to reach somebody in that kind of a situation. But I had this idea that all science denial was the same, that it was based on this blueprint of reasoning. I knew that the 5 techniques, the 5 tropes of technique rebuttal, again, before G.B.H and Schmidt had written about it, I knew these about conspiracy theories and cherry picking and illogic and fake experts and et cetera. And so that's what I talked with them about. And I wanted to take a shot at reaching the hardest of the hardcore. My favorite story about flat Earth is the fellow that was up on stage giving a seminar on how to recruit people into flat Earth. So that's really the ultimate, right? Because I was trying to pull him out, he was trying to pull him in. And some of the techniques he talked about on stage, by the way, be calm, show them respect, don't get angry. Same stuff. So I thought, I got to talk to this guy. So he came off stage and I immediately came up to him and I said, look, I'm a philosopher. I'm not a flat earther. Can I take you to dinner? Can we just talk for a while? He said yes. And we had a 2-hour dinner in which I opened with my question, because I didn't want him. I thought at a certain point he was going to get insulted and run away, which he never did. But I wanted to open with my toughest question just in case I never got another chance. And so I said, what could I possibly say to convince you that you were wrong? What evidence might exist? And the first thing he said was, well, I'd have to go up in a rocket. This was before Bezos and, all these other fellows had, made it possible for civilians to do this. And then he said, no, because the window might be curved in the rocket. So that's not going to work. So then he said, I said, okay, can I propose something? Yeah. So I just gotten out of a seminar in which somebody had argued that Antarctica was not a continent. The flat earthers not only believe that the earth is flat, they think that Antarctica is a mountain range spread out along the perimeter of the earth to keep the water from falling off. So that means that Antarctica is 24,000 miles long. It's not, 1,000 or 1,500 or whatever it is. And so I said to him, look, why don't we fly over Antarctica? And he said that flight doesn't exist, which was another thing I just learned in the seminar. So I'd gone back to my room and Googled it. And I had the sheet printed in my pocket. And I said, yes, it does. Here's a flight we could take from Auckland, New Zealand to Chile. Let's take it. And he said, have you been on that flight? And I said, no, have you? Let's go. And he agreed. He reached out and he shook my hand. And I thought, I'm going to go home to my humanist friends and I'm going to fundraise on this. All my scientists and humanist friends, if everybody just gave $10, we could afford the ticket and we're going to go and we could film it and it's going to be awesome. And then I got to thinking about it and I thought, wait a minute, he's just going to say that the window is curved. I've got to, in the plane as we're flying over it, I've got to figure this out. So I said, look, we're going to need a criteria. We're going to need some way to measure, that we agree on in advance of who's right. How about whether we have to stop and refuel? Because if you're right, it's 24,000 miles long. We're going to have to stop and refuel. If I'm right, and I hope I am, right? Because there's no place to refuel in Antarctica, we can make it on one tank of gas. He shook my hand again, and I thought, yes. But then he took it back. And I'll never forget the next couple of minutes. He said, no, we can't do this because what if the whole thing is a hoax? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, what if no plane ever has to stop for gas? And I said, what do you mean? Planes stop all the time for gas. No plane can go from, New York. I mean, can they go from New York to Hong Kong? Maybe, I don't think at the time they could, but could they go the entire way around the world? No, they couldn't. No plane could do that. And he said, but what if they could? And then knowing that they're conspiracy theorists, I said, are you meaning to tell me that you think that the entire history of air travel since before the time we were born has been a hoax? Against the day when I was going to be standing here with you right now, trying as an agent of the devil, which is what they thought, trying to convince you that you should give up your belief in flat earth. And he said, yes. Now, this was a problem, right? Because I had come there not just to convince them, though that would have been nice, but to get them to listen. But effectively at that point, the conversation was sort of over. But another thing that I learned in talking to them, and this I made a mistake, is that it's not a hit and run. It's not a one-off conversation. If you are going to convince a science denier, you have to do it over time. There were no magic words that I was going to say to get him to give up his beliefs. I should have taken his email. I should have kept up with him. I should still be keeping up with him to try to convince him over time, rather than just say what I wanted to say was, oh, well, I guess your view is based on faith then, isn't it? So zing, but then he hates me and he's never going to change his mind. So I had the good sense not to do that, but I should have kept up the relationship and kept talking to him. So what I learned at the Flat Earth Convention, and I write about this in the book, Tell Some More Stories, is that, I didn't convince anybody to, tear off their lanyard and say what a fool I was, but I did learn how to get them to listen. And I think that's the first step in convincing a science denier to change their mind. Think about the Betch and Schmid article that I talked about. That shows that it's possible. We just have to work at it harder, and more people need to be doing it. And if we continue with this idea that you ask most people to do, not even to do what I did, just to talk to their cousin about anti-vax, they'll say, I don't want to do that. It wouldn't do any good. And, but they're deniers, aren't they? Because Betch and Schmid show that it might do some good. So if you don't want to be a science denier, you have to be open to the idea that there is actually a way to approach people, that it is, people will sometimes say, it's not worth arguing this, people. But it is worth arguing with these people because sometimes it works. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the only way to combat science denial, because there are other factors at work. The creation of disinformation, the amplification of disinformation, and then the uptake of disinformation, right? Those are the three big problems. So my book really deals with the third problem. What you do once the infection has gone rampant in the community and it's out there and we've got to deal with all these people who believe false things. Couldn't we do a little bit, though, about stopping the creation of disinformation and stopping it from being amplified as it is? Almost every flat earther that I spoke to, no, I'm going to say every flat earther that I spoke to was converted based on YouTube videos. That's how it's done. And so thinking about how to rein in social media, thinking about who's behind it, and I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist here because I can back this up. Who's behind the disinformation campaign behind COVID? You know, who's behind the one about climate change? There are people, science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. There are people who are intentionally creating this disinformation, though I can never figure out who with flat earth. But there's somebody who's creating this disinformation and they're doing it for a purpose. Sometimes that purpose is economic, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's ideological. But just look how COVID denial has been has polarized us, has been politicized. There's a purpose behind that. Somebody is doing that for a reason. So I do think that there's more to fighting science denial than just talking. But look, what I just said should make you feel at least that I think that a good deal of the science deniers that you're going to meet in everyday life are victims. They're people who have fallen for this disinformation. They're not getting out of it. Most of the people who believe that climate change is a hoax are not getting rich from, fossil fuels, like some of the folks who came up with the disinformation. Think back to the tobacco campaign in the 50s to, when the tobacco companies tried to show that smoking didn't cause lung cancer. Why do they do that? To protect their profits. Most of the people who believed their lies, they didn't get anything out of it. In fact, they kept smoking cigarettes and died, right? So a lot of science deniers are victims, and we need to think of that. We need to also think about the fact that a lot of the people who are not just creating the disinformation, but disseminating it, there aren't that many of them. There was a study that was reported in NPR not long ago, which showed that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was due to 12 people. Now, back when I was a little boy, 12 science deniers couldn't do that much damage. Every now and then on the street corner, you saw somebody who thought we hadn't gone to the moon, handing out mimeograph sheets. How much damage were they going to do? Not much. But you give that person a Twitter account, you give that person a podcast, they can do enormous damage. Okay. And so that's another aspect of this that we need to think about. In the meantime, a lot of our fellow citizens have gone down that rabbit hole. And I'm going to get political here for a moment and say that I think that science denial is a precursor to post-truth, the political subordination of reality. It's a precursor. All of 60, 70 years of science denial led to Stop the Steal, led to QAnon, led to the idea that the January 6th insurrectionists were actually Antifa. It's the same type of reasoning, those same 5 tropes about cherry picking evidence and conspiracy theories, etc. It's the same type of reasoning. And I think what happened is that some ideologues said, if they can deny the truth about climate change, I can deny the truth about an election. I can deny the truth about anything that I want, whether the murder rate's going up or down, what the path is of a hurricane. We know who I'm talking about here, right? And so I think that this problem is not just getting worse for science. I think that it's getting worse for democracy, for our country. It's getting worse because as we come to live in a denialist culture, it's not just science that's threatened, it's truth itself, it's evidence. It's, the whole idea of reason, really, that's threatened by this. And that's where I'll stop. And I'll say that my goal in writing this book is to create an army of people who feel empowered to go out and talk to people who disagree with them. And I'm doing this too. I mean, you don't have to go to the Flat Earth Convention with me, but here's the advice: talk to the people who already trust you. Don't go out and try to convince people to trust you, because that is really hard to do. You can, and sometimes it works. It worked for Jim Bridenstine, right? And it worked in that, for the anti-vaxxers in Vancouver. The best possible chance that you have to make a difference is to talk to friends and relatives who already trust and love you. But be respectful, be calm. Sometimes with family members, it's easy to get angry, okay? It's easy to say things to them that you'd never say to a stranger. And I'll just tell you, I'm having these conversations right now with my family members, close family members, who will not get the COVID vaccine. So I understand it's very hard to do, but I think that if there were more of us doing it, we can enlarge the community and make Science Deniers feel less alienated, feel like they had more in common with us, and get better information than they're getting from the partisan news sources and from the social media silos that they're currently working in. So I try not to go over time because I want to leave time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. And before we go into questions, I will stop the recording in case one of you wants to speak more freely and not have your questions recorded for all time. But I will quickly start with one question that I don't have a problem with, and that is directly, Lee. I was thinking the other day and hearing some reports about how one of the advantages of having really crazy beliefs or asserting crazy beliefs is finding a community of other like-minded people, is that this kind of pattern, I guess, anthropologically almost, reinforces itself, because the people around you then see the crazy beliefs and sort of reject you. So then you're even more pushed into your group of fellow believers.
Polarized.
So, exactly. So in a way, isn't this related to the fact that we don't have good community building in this country? Everyone is an individual, and then we have this media where you can hook into a group, and the more you assert that, the more likely you are to stay in that group, because everyone else, like say the liberals, will hate you or whatever.
Identity is more polarizing than ideology. Just to put this has been shown empirically by Lilliana Mason, just to put a label on somebody and just to say, oh, they're the other, we don't like them, we hate them, we don't trust them, right? And so part of the reason that you should talk to somebody face to face is because it gets you past some of that. It did. I mean, I may not have convinced any flat earthers, but I think I did get some credibility just from the fact that I showed up. I think maybe they trusted me a little bit more because I'm a human face, that it's, harder to hate if I'm, actually there and outnumbered 650 to 1, right? I'm no threat. But, there I was. But, you bring up a really important point, which is that another thing that a hypothesis that I made in my book is that part of what's behind science denial is the feeling of alienation, the feeling of lack of community. The flat earthers that I met had a gigantic breach of trust in their life. That's what drove them to it. For some of them, it would even constitute trauma, right? There was something in their life that was such a traumatic experience that they decided that they couldn't trust anybody ever again. And once you're in that frame of mind and you get on YouTube, you're a goner, right? Because then how deep does that rabbit hole go? Pretty damn deep. Some of them said that it was 9/11, that they thought, well, 9/11 was too big, it had to be an inside job. That led them to flat earth. I don't quite understand how, but it did. For others, it was a personal crisis, a personal relationship or an illness. But it's something that caused them to question who they could or couldn't trust in their life. That was a big deal for them. And so I do believe that it's about community. I do believe that it's about, building a bridge. And here I'll refer you to some important other reading that you can do. Eli Saslow wrote a great book called Rising Out of Hatred, where he uses the kind of techniques that I'm talking about. I mean, I didn't invent these. He talks about somebody who used these techniques to pull a guy out of white supremacy. There's a book by Daryl Davis, who just won the Humanist Award in Pittsburgh from Andy Norman's group out there. Just Andy Norman's group. I remember I was on Andy's broadcast watching it. And Daryl Davis talks people out of the Ku Klux Klan. They give him their robes. And he does it through friendship. Amazing. I just read Steve Hassan's book about cults. How do you get people out of cults? How do you deprogram them? You love bomb them. You don't tell them they're stupid. You don't give them arguments. You surround them with community and other people who love them. That's how you get them out. So I think you're really onto something here. It's about community. If we could get people away from their computer and their favorite news channel and interacting with other people, we could bring them back. There's a book that's just about to be published by Jen Senko called The Brainwashing of My Dad. I recommend it to everyone. If you haven't seen her documentary, it is amazing. And she tells the story about her dad getting sucked into a news silo and just becoming a different person. And then it was either his radio or his TV or something broke, and then he came back to them. So and I'm glad I just saw in the news today that she's had a book coming out on it, and I'll buy that in a second, because it's an amazing story. It's a great question.
What was the name of that book again? That last book?
The Brainwashing of My Dad. And she's got a documentary on this, and it's incredible. I've been in touch with her a little bit about it. She's an amazing person.
Great. Well, thank you very much.